Okay, look at Torah, Tzav, page Yud Gimel, bottom of the second column. 6 lines in the end of the page. It's 7 lines in the end of the page. Okay, to understand all these things about the two levels of matzah, before Chatzeis, after Chatzeis, with a vav, without a vav. So he said we need to understand what the pasuk says, a man does not live on bread alone, which means that answers the question that Izal says, that how can a person sustain themselves from something lower than them? How can plant life sustain a person? So he answers that you don't live from the Dvar Hashem, from the physical bread, you live from the word of Hashem that's in it, the power of Hashem. So he says, why do we need the power of Hashem that's in plant if we have the power of Hashem that's in us? Hashem said, Nasa Adam. Now the Rabbi explains, because Tzemeach comes in the world of Tehu, and Adam comes in the world of Tikkun, and Tehu is higher than Tikkun, so therefore Tzemeach down here is lower, but up there it's much higher. Adam Tikkun, a person comes in the world of Tikkun. Tikkun is the level of Chochmah Vatzilis. And it's called the bringing down of Seichel. Is with Chochmah you're able to select. For Adam sheyesh bei nefesh hasichlis, a person who has an intellectual soul, sheirish ishtalshalusa ugamkim b'chinas Chochmah. The source of the nefesh, in other words, this. Even though in Tanya basically it says a Jew has two souls, but there's really a third soul. It's called nefesh hasichlis. There's the godly soul, there's the animal soul, and then there's the intellectual soul that decides which one to pick between the good and the bad. But he says that comes from Chochmah Vatzilis. But Shviras HaKelim Shoya Beilam HaTehu is the level of Zayin Midas. The Shviras HaKelim of the world of Tehu, it says in Kabbalah, we're in the Midas of Tehu. Which is called Behemer Rabba. So even though Tikkun is the world of Tikkun is Chochmah, and Shviras HaKelim is in the level of Midas, but L'chei the Seichel is higher than Midas, but here we're talking about Midas of Tehu versus Seichel of Tikkun. So therefore the bottom line is that the Gashmistic things which come from the world of Tehu are able to sustain a person. Okay. But because there was no unity in the world of Tehu, they broke and they fell. They came down lower than the person. Therefore, all the sparks of Tehu, how can they be re-elevated back to Kedusha? It's only through the level of Adam. In other words, like this. The sparks of Tehu fell down into the Gashmistic of things. There were very lofty sparks that fell down into very low places. But now, what's the avodah of a person to select those sparks out of the Gashmistic material and elevate it to Kedusha? Now, those sparks are greater than the person. So when a person refines those sparks, that actually sustains the person. And he says, but after the person refines them, they become elevated, they're able to give life to a person because of their source, which is higher than a person. And that's what the pasuk says, Ki al kol meitzah pi Hashem yechya adam. What does it mean, meitzah pi Hashem? Meitzah pi Hashem, meitzah means what brings out the pi Hashem, meaning the source of dibur. That's the mark of Misham Nimshchali is Gili Amaimoritz. To have the revelation of the utterances from the level of Vayim. Obachinas Mekerim Mishoshim. Hari Alechem Nilkach Muchinas Elyena Yesikanal. So therefore bread, bottom line, comes from a higher place than the person, and therefore food can sustain the person. So now he says also, therefore the utterance of Nasa Adam is the last of all the 10 utterances. Now when you say it's the last means it's the lowest. Why is Nasa Adam lower than Tache Haaretz Desha? Because that taka comes from the world of Tehu. The Meitzah Pi Hashem in the vegetation is from the world of Teil. The last utterance, which is already the lowest, that comes from the world of Tikkun, Nasa Adam. The Kul L'mein Kaidman, L'mein Min Nasa Adam, Hainu Mitamanal for the same reason. Li'ashoshim Be'elam HaTeil, because they come from the world of Teil, Shekadam La'elam HaTik, which is higher than the world of Tikkun, which is the source of person. L'chein Amar Rav Nachman, therefore the Gemara says, the Gemara tells a story that they asked Rav Nachman a question at night, and he didn't answer. The next day he met the guy, and he told him the answer. And he says to him, why didn't I tell you in the morning, at the night? I didn't eat beef. I didn't have meat. I didn't eat dinner, basically. So he says, you know why I didn't answer? So the question is, what does food, what does dinner have to do with being able to answer a question? This is intellect. He says that why? He says, that's why, as everybody knows, on a fast day, which is only totally in the mind, nothing to do with the body, a person becomes completely dysfunctional. Mamish dysfunctional.
Fasting every day.
Huh?
I must be fasting every day.
No, I didn't say it's the only thing that causes dysfunction. No. There's essential dysfunction. Then even by people who are functional, fasting is dysfunctional. Therefore Chazal say, a baby, an infant, doesn't know how to say father until he eats grain. In other words, the food actually adds to the seichel. What does food have to do with seichel? The answer is because food comes from a higher place than seichel. Seichel is tikkun. This comes from teil. It is kisher shamay cholim. Heim lamayla be'elam ha'teil are higher in the world of teil, which is higher than the level of chokhmah of tikkun. Al kein yesh b'makeich v'yechelis l'chazik ol ha'esef. Therefore, food can add to the intelligence of a person.
Food that is elevated, right?
Huh?
The food that is elevated.
Yeah, but the pearl, what happens if the guy doesn't need to make a bracha? It's still, he's not elevating it to Kedusha, but it's still, the food comes from a higher source, and therefore could still sustain him, even though he's not becoming Kedusha.
It's not Kedusha.
Right. That's all in Gashmis. What's in serving Hashem? He says, this is the 288 sparks of Tehu that come into the Gashmistic things that become elevated above through the level of Tikkun, which is Shadish of Nefesh Olekis. How is that? How do you elevate it to Kedusha? When you eat, and then you daven and say Krishma, and you learn. Then when those food becomes elevated, you're eating the food for the sake of Shem Shemayim, so therefore the sparks of Tehu that are in that food become elevated back to Tehu. And therefore it adds in the strength of meditation and being affected. Then it even becomes greater than the nefesh ulikis atzma. Now, why? Because lias malubish barapach nitzutzim. The tail, it has higher sparks in the world of tail. Therefore, it's able to add an elevation, even to the godly soul. Okay, so the bottom line of Avodah is saying, when a person eats and then they elevate the sparks of Kedusha, so then, in fact, they accomplish a much greater level. Therefore, according to this, we understand why you don't fast, you don't break all those things, because the whole purpose is not to break it, but to elevate it. To elevate it to Kedusha. Because if you don't eat, then those sparks, you can't elevate to Kedusha.
Don't we say that what was the name? One of the tzaddikim, that they didn't eat, and then when they answered, they said, Amen Yehesh Rava, they became corpulent because of that.
Nachum Chernobyl.
Oh, Nachum Chernobyl. So he didn't even have to eat in a way. He said, Amen Yehesh
Because he got fat from the enjoyment of Amen Yeshma. We get fat from the enjoyment of the food. He got fat from the enjoyment of Amen Yehesh Merabah.
When somebody puts the flame,
What?
when somebody puts the flame, and okay, so at that time the feeling gets elevated.
The tefillin is already elevated.
No, but when you use it over and over and over, what does that mean?
I don't know if the tefillin get holier. You're saying used tefillin are holier than new ones? I don't know.
I'm saying so you, any time you use a keli, you do a mitzvah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe the keli becomes elevated even more. Maybe every time the tefillin become holier. I don't know. But the person definitely becomes holier.
It's in Tanya that it says that there is a sheep in Australia and then somebody in Korea. And then
It doesn't say that in Tanya about Korea and Australia.
The
No.
point is that when you put it on, you elevate the whole thing.
That's the person doing a mitzvah. In the base of Migdosh, okay, they had every korban had diamond sameach chaim medaber. There was always flour offering. There was wine, the inanimate things, salt and all that. And then you had the animal, and then you had the person bringing it. So it says when they brought a korban, all mankind was elevated, all animal, all plant, all inanimate. So when a person does a mitzvah with wool, all the world in the world becomes elevated. But that's very indirect. Because now the person is elevating wool. Yes? If you elevate wool, all wool in the world has something connected with each other. It's all wool.
So there's sparks of Kedusha when the wool is elevated.
Yeah, but not as much as the object you're using for the mitzvah, obviously.
That's one.
Okay. So now he says, now we can understand this whole matzah bit. Now, based on this, so we speak about, because Al Rebbe asked the question at the beginning, what are these matzahs before Chatzos, after Chatzos, this whole thing of matzah. So he starts explaining that the Gashmistic thing that comes to the world of Teiu. It's higher. So now we can understand the concept of matzah based on that with the two levels of matzah. So he says, in Api Agdama now Yuv and Gamkim Binyan Achilas Matzah Pesach. Now we can understand the inyan of eating matzah and Pesach. The Mavur B'Zayat Vayetzek. The Zayat explains the K'mei Shabbos Golas Gashmis. Just like in the physical, he quoted the Gemara before that says, Ein atinik yodea maskul klum. A tinnik, a baby, doesn't understand anything until they eat, like he explained before. So the same thing spiritually. What's the spiritual? B'tzeis Yisrael Mitzrayim, when the Yidden left Mitzrayim, Leyodu lahaskel gdulas Hashem. They didn't have the ability to understand the greatness of Hashem. Ad she'ochlu matzah. She bechinas lechem hayetzim min ha'aretz al yena. In other words, matzah is like spiritual food that, just like physical food, allows somebody who doesn't understand anything to understand. Why? Because the food, the sparks of Kedusha in the food, add to the intellect of the person. The same thing in a spiritual sense. The Jews didn't have an understanding of Elokus until they ate matzah, which is holy. Shameitza pi Hashem, nimshel belechem zeh, based on the word of Hashem that's in this matzah. V'nefesh ulekis leidu lahakit, to know and to realize, recognize. Misham avaya ilam, that the Eibishter, or kamesh and nimshel chayis tam lenefesh hasich, just like the physical brain gets chayis from bread, Kach nimshach ma'achilas matzah b'Pesach chayis l'daf nefesh l'kitz. It also adds to the nefesh l'kitz. Because matzah, therefore it says in Zohar that the first night of Pesach, matzah is called michla de menusa, food of emunah. So it said when you eat matzah, you strengthen your emunah. Second night is michla das vasa, food of healing. It's not a joke that when people were sick, the Rabbi used to give them shmona matzah. Well, there was a Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe, who was a pharmacist. But in those days, he used to grind, they used to make their own medicine. So that Chassidus would take matzah from the Alter Rebbe, and he ground it up, and in every medicine he made, he put a few drops of that matzah from the Alter Rebbe that should have its effect. But food, just like there's physical food enhancing the physical brain, there's spiritual food, physical, but there's spiritual food that enhances the spirituality of the person. The amunah, the seichel. Okay, so what does it mean? Well, inyan is like this. Ki chametz, what's the difference between chametz and matzah? Chametz is the level of hagbah v'isnasus, elevation, ego, basically. Shetefech ve'elo magbi'at, makes himself better than everybody else. Masha'en ki matzah ein beishum hagbah. Matzah doesn't rise, it's bittul. Ukmei ki ma'avedas Hashem. The same thing in Aveda, just like physically this rises and this doesn't. The same thing in Avedas Hashem. Chametz of Bechinas is Nasis Vegasas Haklipa. Chametz is the level of ego, haughtiness. Masha'en Kim Bechinas Matzah is Shifloch Vachna on the level of Bato Retzeincha, of nullifying your will. And he says, that's like it says in the Pasuk, is Chametz Levavi. My heart became Chametz. Him shalaleva neitel ashilo chametz. V'chein b'lashon razal. The same thing the Gemara speaks about a person before he sinned and after he sinned. So the Gemara says, kan kedim shehichmitz. One thing is before he became chametz, meaning before he sinned. One was after he sinned. V'kach mashla yes yetzer hara l'se'er. The same yetzer is also likened to yeast that makes it rise. Like the Gemara says, mi ma'akif. Who stops a person from doing mitzvahs? Sir should be isa ma'akif. The yeast, meaning the yetzer hara, doesn't allow it. B'nei shugas asamako konfios the taivet v'chomine ra'avayishmin. The source of all evil is from ego. What?
Can you cite any good examples of transition of spirituality into physical food or something?
Every time you do a mitzvah, you have tefillin, right? Yes? You took physical leather, physical parchment, and you infused it with kedusha. Any mitzvah. Not only that, when a person eats, and they make a bracha, I mean, obviously kosher, that's not any question. A person eats food, they make a bracha, and they're eating it for the right purposes. The food becomes as holy as a korban.
I'm saying any in the writings in the Torah that suggest that states that.
All the mitzvahs, the Torah makes it holy.
Oh, it says.
Yeah. Right.
You make a transformation from something.
Correct.
Something